Hello everyone, and welcome to another Cut Rate Commander Precon Upgrade Guide, the series where we take a look at Precon decks and bring them up to cut rate standards. My name is Grazzet, and today we'll be looking at the Revenant Recon Precon from Murders at Karlov Manor and its face commander, the Return to Dimir Mental Manipulator, Mirko Obsessive Theorist, which we'll be bringing up from its roughly $40 price point to an increased budget of $75 after upgrades. But before we continue, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed this content. And, if you really enjoyed it, please consider supporting the channel directly through either Buy Me a Coffee or through our Game Nerds affiliate link in the description. Also, be sure to stick around until the end of the video to see what Precon upgrade we'll be covering next. So, with that out of the way, let's start by taking a look at the commander and playstyle. Mirko Obsessive Theorist is a 1/3 vampire detective with flying and vigilance that costs 1 and Dimir that has the following 2 abilities. Firstly, whenever we surveil, we put a +1/+1 counter on Mirko. And secondly, at the beginning of our end step, we may return target creature with power less than Mirko's from our graveyard to the battlefield with a finality counter on it. Breaking down his core stats, Mirko is sporting a lower midweight CMC, a low power average toughness stat block for his cost with built-in keywords to make him evasive and to let us keep him up to block after attacking, and a pair of abilities that greatly benefit from House Dimir's unique ability to surveil, both by growing Mirko himself and enabling him to reanimate bigger and bigger creatures. Taking a closer look at his first ability, it functions as a simple but effective surveil payoff, allowing us to turn Mirko into an evasive commander damage dealing beatstick as we use surveil sources to generate us card selection and fill up our bin, which Dimir has absolutely no shortage of, seeing as this is one of their primary mechanics. That said, it's important to keep in mind that Mirko specifically cares about how many times we surveil versus how much we surveil for, making smaller but repeatable sources of surveil a much more reliable way to quickly grow him, instead of bigger one-shot sources of surveil which he may only benefit from once. This then leads nicely into his second ability, which takes advantage of all the graveyard setup we'll be doing by effectively turning Mirko into the Dimir version of Mirren of Clan Niltoth, reanimating our creatures each turn at no mana cost. However, unlike Mirren, Mirko comes with the caveat that those creatures come back into play with finality counters on them, making them harder to repeatedly reanimate due to being exiled upon their death, but, as we saw in the Ahoy Mateys Precon, not exactly impossible, as we have plenty of tools in Dimir to, at worst, remove those counters via counter-removing effects or via flickering our creatures so they can hit our bin again, and, at best, turning those counters into value for ourselves so they become less of a liability and more of a bonus. One thing to keep in mind, however, is that, also unlike Mirren, this ability is tied to his power, which when combined with his ability to grow himself with counters, and being naturally evasive to reliably get in for damage, will make him a very desirable target for removal to prevent further damage and to deny us value by forcing us to build him up again. So protection against targeting and removal will be absolutely necessary to keep him alive for as long as possible if we want to get the maximum value out of him. So, as we can see based on his abilities, Mirko Obsessive Theorist is clearly a surveil and reanimation focused commander, aiming to make full use of the surveil mechanic to grow himself into a legitimate threat while he builds up our board with more and more reanimated creatures with each passing turn. And to its credit, the base build does a very solid job at enabling this game plan, including a variety of one-shot and repeatable sources of surveil to help empower our commander and set up our bin, a decent number of surveil payoffs to generate us additional value while we do so, and an okay number of reanimation targets for Mirko to recur with his passive reanimation, not to mention an absolutely fantastic suite of reprinted reanimation spells to reanimate even more creatures with. That said, while this deck certainly is decent out of the gate, there are a few issues I encountered when testing it that, in my opinion, hamper Mirko's ability to be as effective as he could be. ranging from a lack of ways to protect Mirko from removal, or to remove finality counters from our creatures, making Mirko and the creatures he reanimates incredibly vulnerable to removal, a bit too much of a focus on non-creature spells with surveil, which can result in turns in which we're leaving a card on top of our deck multiple times because we can't easily reanimate that card, and, to a lesser extent, not the most optimized selection of reanimation targets for us to cheat into play to impact the board. So, in an effort to fix these issues, we'll be adding in a suite of protection sources for our commander to ensure he can grow unimpeded to be able to inflict the most commander damage and reanimate the biggest creatures, a selection of counter-removing entrants to make it significantly easier to continually reanimate our creatures more than once, and more numerous and more powerful reanimation targets for us to be able to reanimate with Mirko to take over the game with. And then, once we've refined our surveil suite a bit more to help enable our commander more efficiently, Mirko will have all the tools he'll need for him and his reanimated allies to drag our opponents kicking and screaming into the catacombs beneath Ravnica. So let us make our way to a hidden Dimir safe house in an undisclosed district of Ravnica, where we'll find Mirko Vosk meticulously poring over Dimir secret documents, stolen Wojek reports, and even the odd extracted memory or two, all in an effort to answer a singular question: just who is Lazav? Even he, a high-ranking Dimir operative that had dedicated years into uncovering Lazav's identity, knew precious little about their guild leader. What he had discovered, however, terrified him. Lazav was no mere shapeshifter and mind mage. No, he was entirely something else, a being capable of bending reality itself to suit his needs, and his ambitions were no less grand than his power, aiming to subvert the other guilds of Ravnica under his control. But, most concerningly, was that he allegedly answered to a higher power, a being more powerful than Lazav himself who pulled the strings on the Master Manipulator. This terrible truth was what had consumed Vosk into delving even more frantically into discovering his identity. For if this was all true, there was a looming threat that would make Nicol Bolas and even the Phyrexian invasion pale in comparison. A threat whose identity would begin to reveal itself if he could only answer one question: who is Lazav? So, now that we know a bit more about the commander and playstyle, let's jump straight into the upgrades. So, the very first thing we'll be focusing our efforts on in this upgrade will be to make Mirko more resilient against our opponent's attempts to remove him, as once he's grown into a 7+ power threat that can reanimate bigger and bigger threats each turn, our opponents won't hesitate to remove him and force us to build him up all over again. As such, we'll be cutting Baleful Strix, which is an okay value-focused reanimation target, but pales in comparison to other ones already in the build and that we'll be adding into it, in favor of Champion's Helm, which not only makes our commander immune to targeting thanks to granting him hexproof, but also provides him with a solid stat boost so he can reanimate bigger creatures right out of the gate. Letting go of Whispering Snitch, which on paper seems like a good surveil payoff with its AoE life drain, but in practice doesn't do enough as it is only limited to once per turn and will be primarily surveilling on just our turn, to make space for Swiftfoot Boots, which function as nice and a cheap targeting protection that, occasionally, we can use to allow any bigger creatures we hardcast to swing in the turn they come down. Shelving Mission Briefing, which admittedly can allow us to recast some of our fantastic reanimation spells, but after upgrades, will lack the number of instant and sorcery targets to make it worth reliably running here, to add in a Narok Stealth Suit, which again provides targeted removal protection in the form of Shroud, that, thanks to allowing us to attach it as well as equip it, we can use to protect our more valuable reanimation targets at instant speed if we have the mana, and terraforming the graveyard-centric man-land hostile desert into the counter-distributing Tyrite Sanctum, which initially allows us to get more counters onto Mirko to grow him even faster, and later, we can use it to get an indestructible keyword counter on him to further increase his survivability. Then, with the resilience of our commander greatly improved, we can switch our sights to adding in ways to remove the finality counters off of the creatures he reanimates, so we can continually reanimate them as our opponents inevitably remove them. In which we'll be replacing Thoughtbound Phantasm, who loses out to evasive creatures that also grow as we surveil that can more reliably get in for damage, with Soul Diviner, which provides us with a manaless way to turn the finality counters on our creatures into repeatable draw, sidelining the legend Marvo Deep Operative, who deserves a build of his own but lacks the critical mass of high CMC spells needed here to make him truly effective, to slot in Fane the Broker, who instead turns our finality counters into ramp via his treasure creation to help us speed up our mana base, and swapping out Epheria's Dispersal, which is an okay surveilling removal spell, but falls short here in comparison to removal on bodies which our commander can get multiple uses out of, in favor of Hexavus, which is not only a fantastic reanimation target for Mirko, since it's a 0/0 in the bin that turns into a 6/6 evasive flyer when it gets on board, but it can also consume multiple finality counters per turn to make itself bigger, and then use those counters to grant permanent evasion to our other creatures so they can swing in safely alongside our commander. And then, as some non-creature based sources of counter removal to round out this category, we'll be raising the flat-out Badland Temple of the False God so we can give it spot to power Conduit, which lets us turn the finality counters on our creatures into +1/+1 counters for our commander to grow him even faster, and terraforming the land cycling land ash barrens into the counter-removing land nesting grounds, which can hilariously transfer our creatures' finality counters onto our opponent's creatures so we can exile their creature base instead. Now, with what I would consider the core build's main issues fixed, we'll be using the remainder of our budget to improve this deck's ability to surveil in order to build up our commander and set up our graveyard more reliably, as well as increasing and refining our pool of reanimation targets so we hit them more often as we surveil, and so they have a larger impact on the board as we resurrect them. Starting in the former camp, we'll be cutting the just okay removal or reanimation source Connive and Concoct so we can make space for the Grim Captain's Locker, which provides the build with another source of repeatable surveil that, once our graveyard becomes saturated with excess cards we can't recur, we can start using as another reanimation source via its escape granting to get more of our creatures back into play, scrapping the unfocused Egg Ransom Note so it can be replaced with the Mana Rock Laser Screwdriver, which accelerates our mana base and can repeatedly surveil unlike its predecessor, the strange O-ring-like Foreboding Steamboat being smelted down into Sword of Once and Future, which provides Mirko with on-attack surveil, lets us recur some solid reanimation spells and or efficient surveilling cantrips from our bin, and offers some solid protection against relevant colors along with a decent stat bump on top of that to help keep our commander alive and enable him, the OK clone Vizier of Many Faces being phased out for Starving Revenant, whose ETB surveil/draw effect is decent, and whose graveyard-focused repeatable AoE life drain fits in nicely with our graveyard-focused playstyle, and the serviceable surveil-themed draw source Notion of Rain being slotted out so we can slot in Sanguine Spy, which now surveils thanks to its errata, fits better into this build now that we can get our finality counters off of our creatures, so it can sack them away to be reanimated again while it surveils more for us, and, once we get enough cards in our bin, functions as a decent source of repeatable card advantage as well. And lastly, we'll be removing the top deck Manipulating Brainstorm, and the Split Spell Cantrip/AoE Pseudo Edict Discovery and Dispersal, so we can add a Search for Escanta and Think Tank in their place, which, like Sanguine Spy, have been eroded to now surveil, making them both reliable ways for us to passively grow our commander and fill up our bin with each passing turn. Then taking a look at the new creatures that will be surveilling into the bin to be reanimated, we'll kick things off with some new sources of removal by replacing the surveilling removal spells Price of Fame and Pylon with the flash speed removal creatures Necron Deathmark and Caladius Assassin, which may not surveil when we use them, but offer us the flexibility of using them as flash speed removal if we draw into them, or as removal on a body that we can reanimate if we surveil them into our graveyard, with the former also letting us set up our bin even further by milling us, while the latter becomes a copy of whatever creature it destroys so we can use it against our opponents, shelving the impressive but 2-mana intensive counterspell counterpoint, along with the 2-mana intensive self-copying creature copy catchers for the ETB removal golems Noxious Gearhulk and Meteor Golem, which give us access to even more ETB removal on bodies for us to reanimate, with the first being limited to creatures but helping us pad our life totals as it destroys its targets, and the latter being able to hit any non-land permanent for improved flexibility, and replacing the OK creature exiling removal source Amphin Mutineer with the more reanimation-focused removal source Canoptic Tomb Sentinel, which exiles any non-land permanent as we reanimate it from the bin to help us deal with an even wider array of threats. Then briefly switching gears to a more ramp-focused reanimation target, we'll be smelting down Everflowing Chalice, which is an okay mana rock, but doesn't really synergize with this deck's playstyle apart from providing mana acceleration, so we'll be reforming it into Burnished Heart, which in this build functions as a more on-theme source of repeatable land-based ramp now that we're able to reliably get the finality counters off of it. And then to cap off the new wave of bodies for Mirko to reanimate, we'll be slotting out the somewhat weird inclusion Sphinx of the Second Sun, whose only purpose in the deck seems to be to net us some extra mileage out of the handful of surveil effects that trigger on our upkeep, along with the mediocre draw spell Deep Analysis to slot in the backbreaking Praetors, Shuldred Whispering One, and Jingataxis Core Augur, who at 6 and 5 power respectively aren't that hard for Mirko to reanimate, and each of which can completely take over the game if they stick around for even a single rotation, with the former picking apart our opponent's boards with her Edict effect and building up our board with additional reanimation, while the latter strips away all our opponent's cards in hand while completely reloading our hands each turn, making them both fantastic reanimation targets and creatures that can greatly benefit from our excess protection sources to have them stick around for longer. And finally, as our last change to the build, we'll be terraforming the bounce land Dimir Aqueduct into the check land Drowned Catacomb to help speed up our mana base just a smidge. So, now that we've covered all 25 cards that we've upgraded from the core build, let's take a look at the breakdown for this Precon upgrade. This deck currently has 35 creatures including our commander, 3 instants, 5 sorceries, 8 enchantments, 13 artifacts, 0 planeswalkers, and 36 lands. Looking at the stats that matter to our game plan, we have 22 sources of surveil, 5 cards that care about us surveilling, 14 cards that can reanimate themselves or others, 7 cards that care about our graveyard outside of reanimation, 18 creatures with ETB effects, 14 creatures with passive or on-attack effects, 5 cards that can remove finality counters from our creatures, and 5 cards that can protect our commander from targeting or removal, leaving us with a very solid surveil and reanimation focused build with a solid core of surveil sources to get our cards in the bin and empower our commander, along with a small payoff suite for it to generate us even more value, plenty of cards that can bring back or take advantage of our creatures in the bin, a robust gallery of reanimation targets with abilities that proc as they come down or as they stick around on the battlefield, and even a handful of ways for us to remove the finality counters off of our creatures to be able to reanimate them continually, and ways to protect our commander from removal to allow him to stick around for longer so he can grow unimpeded and continually reanimate our creatures. Then for general deck stats, we have 10 ramp sources, 9 card draw sources, 11 targeted removal sources, and 3 board wipes, with our draw being slightly lower than average in this deck, which is made up for by the huge amount of card selection we generate through surveil, and the amount of value we'll be generating from our graveyard. Looking at our mana curve, we have 4 1-drops, 19 2-drops, 13 3-drops, 6 4-drops, 5 5-drops, 8 6-drops, 4 7-drops, 1 9-drop, and 1 10-drop, leaving us with a somewhat odd-looking curve with a dip in the middle that wants to get our commander alongside some surveil sources on board as quickly as possible, ideally with some way to protect our commander from removal alongside them. Then from there, it's just a matter of us patiently growing our commander as we set up our bin through our surveil sources, reanimating bigger and bigger bodies with powerful effects as our commander deals more and more evasive commander damage, all the while removing the finality counters on our creatures to generate us even more value, until our opponents inevitably fold under the relentless onslaught of our commander and his reanimated minions. The final price of this build then comes out to be $74.56 after upgrades. This price does not include tax or shipping and assumes that the price you paid for the Precon was $40. The price of the cards was calculated by using the cheapest listed marketplace price on TCG Player at the time of this recording. Now, for side grades, we can consider replacing Dimir's Spybug with Candlestick if we want to cut our surveil payoffs in order to simply surveil more often as our commander swings in, while also providing him with a small stat bump outside of that to make his reanimation more effective. Jingataxius Core Augur can be replaced with Auton Soldier if we don't want to be as mean towards our opponents, and or would rather have a way to double up on our commander's growth and reanimation by getting an extra non-legendary copy of him into play, and, depending on how much its final price ends up being, we can look into swapping out Twilight Prophet for Dimir Strandcatcher to give us access to another manaless and repeatable source of surveil that also functions as a card advantage generating surveil payoff on top of that to better fit with this deck's overall playstyle. Then, for additional upgrades, Meteor Golem can be traded out for Agent of Treachery, whose lower power makes it easier to reanimate with Mirko, and not only removes any kind of permanent threat when it comes down, but also steals it for us so we can turn it against its controller. Overseer of the Damned can be replaced with Jingataxius Progress Tyrant, whose passives generate us considerable value by letting us double up on all our artifact, instant, and sorcery spells, while simultaneously heavily disrupting our opponent's ability to cast those very same spells by countering the first one they cast each turn. And Phyrexian Arena can be sidelined for Toxrill the Corrosive, which functions as a backbreaking way to inflict -4/-4 to all our opponent's boards with each rotation, while also generating us board presence and card advantage as they lose their boards. And finally, if we want to get mileage out of all graveyards instead of just our own, we can shelve Black Sun Zenith in favor of Ancient Brass Dragon, which can reanimate huge swaths of creatures from both our and our opponent's graveyards every time it connects, while also being a massive evasive beatstick, and honestly, doesn't even cost that much to add in comparison to other top-end upgrades, which should tell you the state of card pricing when $15 is considered a reasonable price to pay for a piece of cardboard. Thanks everyone for sticking around until the end of the video. So, now that we've covered the Revenant Recon Precon, it's time for us to go undercover and tackle the Deadly Disguise Precon, along with its face commander, the always watching Coust Eyes of the Glade. So look forward to a face-down themed build featuring him coming soon. And lastly, before we close out, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't done so already, as this channel can't continue to grow without your support. And if you're feeling particularly generous, feel free to keep me caffeinated via buying me a coffee at the link in the description, or alternatively, use our Game Nerds affiliate link in the description if you're looking to purchase sealed MTG product, accessories, board games, or any of their other wide selection of products at low prices that include free shipping for orders over $75, and a rewards program that builds up store credit over time as you make your purchases. And if any of you would like to support the channel in a different way, feel free to check out the other deck techs floating around my head if you'd like to see the latest builds, or click on the link above for a playlist of all the Cut Rate Commander episodes I've made so far. And with that, have a good one folks, and stay safe.